Welcome everyone to the arena. Today we pit the GTX 980 against the RTX 2080 in a set of rigorous trials of combat in an ultimate death battle. Just kidding. However, today we will be pushing both these graphics cards to the limit with a set of the most popular multiplayer games on the market set to maximum graphical settings, a good looking single player game, and some benchmarking software for a more controlled set of results. So a battle, just with a more civilized way of settling the dispute. The idea of this video is to show the difference between one of the higher tier cards of a couple of generations ago compared to one in this generation, and whether if you are wanting to crank up your graphics, hit those juicy frame rates for high refresh monitors, or just stare at higher numbers on your screen, then is an upgrade worth it for you. Today we're testing two graphics cards kindly provided by MSI, with the MSI RTX 2080 Duke coming in at 1515 MHz base and 1845 MHz boost with 8GB of GDDR6 memory versus the GTX 980 Afterburner overclocked version 1 at 1252 MHz boost and 1152 MHz base with 4GB of GDDR5 VRAM. Both of these cards are the early overclock cards from the Founders Editions, though the Duke has a custom Torx fan 2.0 and more intricate heat pipes, base plate and general cooling solution, plus has a pretty heavy duty backplate to give it some nice build quality. On the other side, the Afterburner has the Founders Edition single fan and close to original design. This does mean that the Afterburner likely runs at higher temperatures and has less overclocking potential from the start. However, both of these cards were only tested using their base boost clock speed. Also, the rest of the build is the same and was thankfully provided by Overclockers UK, who gave one of their pre-built systems, which originally had a 1060 in it but was taken out, with the Co-Link Punisher MIDI tower case in black with their logo, the MSI Z390 Gaming Edge AC motherboard, Intel i5-8600K at 4.4 GHz, Radeon Tech Lito CPU cooler, 16GB of Team Group Vulkan T-Force DDR4 2400 MHz memory, a Co-Link KL600 600W power supply, and 2TB Seagate hard disk drive, and everything was sent cable managed and ready to go out of the box, which was very handy. And I do admit, I had made a little bit of a mess with the GPU power cables as I brought them out of the zip ties and sleeves, so that was my fault, not theirs. The rest of it was very neat. Anyway, let's dive into the games and results. Though before we start, it is worth mentioning that the footage that will be shown has all been recorded using the RTX 2080. Plus, the process of recording was with Shadowplay, which does knock a few frames per second off the results, and which is why it'll be obvious in the software test segment when you see the FPS displayed, they're actually kind of out of line with the actual FPS I got in the benchmarking, as all benchmarkings were made with the Fraps benchmarking tool without any recording software. So the average is the average of several samples of 200 seconds of gameplay taken with Fraps. Min and max is the lowest and highest frames of all those samples. It is hard to get consistent benchmarks with gameplay, however, the results do clearly highlight the difference. But that's also why I will also show a more controlled software benchmarks through Unigine and 3D Mark. All the tests were also at 1080p to match all of my monitors, which are both 144Hz. First up in the arena is Apex Legends. So all graphics were set to the highest possible, plus the field of view was maxed out. And I always play with Wraith, a bit of a meme, I know, every time, seeing as abilities probably do affect your frame per seconds a little bit. Portals and nether powers aside, I also tried to land in the same spot as much as possible, or just generally around the area. Some general observations of all of the frames, recording from the jump ship, so I always recorded from the start of the jump. The FPS was quite low in the air, so there must be not so much lower quality textures loading in as you're dropping, or generally that you can see so much of the map that you do have quite an FPS drop. I was also quite aggressive and tried to get into fights as much as I could, though sometimes you just land and can't find anything. So on to the results. The 980 came in with a minimum of 25 FPS and a maximum of 121 and an average of 60 frames per second. Whereas the 2080 came in with a minimum of 91, a maximum of 145 and an average of 136. Now there was a bit of an issue I hadn't realized going into the results, and that is the game always puts on a form of VSync on and frames per second capping. That's why the maximum was at 145, and all my results for the 2080 were about 145 maximum. So I'd already done all the results, packed away the computer and all of the components when I came to the results to sit down and think, wait a second, that's 145. However, my monitor is only 144 Hz, and I went back and my main PC has a 1080 in it, and I was testing it out, and I was able to punch above 200 frames per second on that build, so I'm almost certain the 2080 will do similar. However, to get rid of this, you actually have to put a command line into the launcher and to get rid of it. So essentially the highest settings in the game I actually put in, and unless you actually go in and put that command line in, which is a bit of a farce, then you won't be able to unlock and uncap the FPS totally. So it kind of is the highest settings you can actually get in the game without actually messing around with stuff outside of the game. Anyway, the 2080 was playable to the point that you could be competitive. Honestly, if you've got a 144 Hz monitor, you're going to be hitting that a lot of the time, and even in fights you're going to be going down to maybe like the lower hundreds if it's really hectic, which isn't too much of an issue, as it will still be pretty smooth. And to get like a consistent 144 Hz for your monitor, only a few of the settings will need to be tweaked a little bit. I do think that in games like this, if you're only going for competitive, then turning down some of the settings would be what you do anyway. Although honestly, the game does look gorgeous at the top settings, so I think as many as possible, as much FPS you can get as possible, I think does enhance the experience to a certain degree, but that's obviously going to be personal preference whether you like graphics or being super duper competitive. The 980's low performance definitely inhibited my ability to play with the FPS drops and would need settings to be pulled right down, though you could do that and get similar results just at way lower settings. I was actually surprised how power hungry Apex Legends can be at those higher settings. Moving on to the next gaming combatant in the arena, and that is PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds of PUBG. And so for a bit of control on this one, I played in Sandhawk every time and tried to keep things fair in the same map, landing in relatively the same area and being relatively aggressive, and everything is in the highest preset, including extra sharpening, which made it a custom setup rather than just the highest setting, the maximum. And also bumping that field of view up to maximum again, which I always like. And unlike Apex Legends, I thought that the lowest frames per second would be on the dropship on the plane, but actually there seems to be some sort of low textures which were keeping it consistently higher, especially for the 980, which struggled a little bit outside of the drop. And that's where the highest FPS in the min-max is going to come out with the results. I didn't record, however, from the starting zone, but these were probably the lowest with both of these, and especially the 980, because you can't fight in the starting zone and there's like 100 people in a small space, so the performance does definitely take a hit, but it's not really going to affect your game. Anyway, with the results, the 980 got a min of 38 FPS, a maximum of 118, and average FPS of 70. The 2080 got a minimum of 74, maximum of 338. I honestly don't know where this came from. It's probably whilst I was looking on the ship looking at something, an average of 168. So PUBG on max was okay to play on the 980, but not too competitive if you have a higher Hertz monitor. But I mean, if you're only playing at that 60 frames per second or a 60 Hertz monitor, then I mean, it's probably going to do its job. However, for the most part, the 2080 was getting the average of like plus 144, so you won't be having issues with frames on a 144 Hz monitor, although I probably still would crank a few of the settings down, and it might be that PUBG just has a little bit less of optimization generally. There wasn't really a noticeable drop during fights. I'm not sure where the sort of 74 came from, but it still was playable and competitive and generally a good performance. There wasn't anything noticeable like drops or jitters or anything on the 2080, though there were noticeable drops on the 980. Moving on to the third contender, Overwatch. So this one's interesting. I played on the highest preset, which is Epic, with the FPS capped off and with the highest field of view. So on the 980, we have a minimum of 49 and a maximum of 92 with an average of 69 frames per second. whereas the 2080 comes in with a minimum of 100 frames per second and a maximum of 193 frames per second, with an average of 148 frames per second. This actually shows something really interesting with the 980 struggling quite a bit with Overwatch, which you probably wouldn't expect actually, or I wouldn't expect from such an old game. And the 2080 here is very playable, looks good. For 144Hz monitor, absolutely fine, you're going to be competitive, and with even just the lowest drop, with a minimum of 100, it's mostly going to be over the hundreds mark most of the time, around 140. And with Overwatch, it isn't like not looking at anything or not in action all the time. Pretty much most of the game you're in action, so that average is pretty spot on because there's no sort of downtime between the fights. But the biggest factor in the FPS drops with the 980 and the 2080 is the render scaling. So the default Epic settings have 141% render scaling, which is a form of anti-aliasing. It will hugely impact your frames per second. Whereas I wouldn't say the effect is hugely noticeable for that setting. And actually the FPS on the 980 with that setting turned off was getting to around the 100-110 mark, whereas the 2080 was getting well above the 200 mark, like just a lot of the time it was plus 200 and averaging out 220-ish. So both of the cards, if you take that render scaling to 100% rather than 141%, can get a lot of performance boost out of a little change and a little graphical change. Although the 2080 still is pulling by far ahead in these results, although the 980 with 144Hz monitor will be fine at 100% render scaling. Although if you do want to go the full settings, you want to go for this 141% render scaling, then, and you've got a 144Hz monitor, then the 2080 would definitely be a shout. Plus, if you have a much higher Hertz monitor, refresh rate monitor, you could still have the 2080 if you turn that render scaling down for those really high frame rates. So Overwatch was an interesting one actually. So next up is Far Cry Primal. Now this game is a couple of years old, however it still looks stunning. Both of these cards were put to the test a little bit here. And the Far Cry series has for a long time been very keen on the graphics. Even from Far Cry 1 was quite revolutionary for its time. So the settings here were all maxed out alongside the field of view being maxed out. All I did for testing was try to stay in the similar area every time, as it is a free roam game, and wondered until I found several fights, and that was pretty much my go-to, just staying in the same zones. Anyway, for the results, the 980 got a minimum of 51, maximum of 145, an average of 66 frames per second, whereas the 2080 got a minimum of 91, maximum of 174, an average of 116 frames per second. Now, that sort of 50 FPS gap in a game that is designed to be dead gorgeous and cranked up to graphics full is quite a big deal. However, I do think with single player games it is less important that you get the spot on high frames per second, because you're not necessarily being competitive with it, you're just going around enjoying the sights and having fun. Although the 980 wasn't super duper smooth compared to what the 2080 could bring, even though both of these were taxed quite a bit. Though if you're a stickler for that 140 frames per second, pretty much average, I'm sure you could turn down one or two of the settings for the 2080 to get the frames for your monitor's refresh rate. Finally, on to the benchmarks. And like I said, with the games, it is harder to test with 100% accuracy how they can perform, as there's loads of different things going on. In multiplayer games, no single game is the same. Even in a single player game when you're roaming, I think there's RNG elements on Far Cry Primal where they spawn different things, so it wasn't always the same experience. However, these benchmarks with the software will push the GPU to its limit and also be quite a controlled environment and a bit more like a scientific experiment. Anyway, first up we had the Unigine superposition benchmark, with the 980 hitting a minimum of 15 frames per second, maximum of 22.19, average of 19.08 frames per second. And the score was 2,550, whereas the 2080 was a minimum of 40.77, maximum of 66.54, an average of 52.61. Again, showing quite a stark contrast here, with a score of 7,034 for the 2080. Worth noting is that the footage is recorded with Shadowplay, like I said at the start, so there is a bit of an FPS drop, so it isn't the same as the actual benchmarks I did without any recording software added. And this is definitely quite a strenuous graphical test plus with a lot of physics operations, and really shows the newer architecture and double the memory of the RTX 2080 at work, and is generally quite a stunning benchmark actually. The second benchmark we used the 3D Mark benchmarking software, which has a few different graphical tests and a CPU test. Let's go on to the, first of all, the 980, which had in test 1 an average of 26.57 frames per second, and test 2 23.28 frames per second. Whereas the 2080 had an average in test 1 of 71.33 frames per second, and test 2 65.15 frames per second. Something interesting on this result is that the CPU was actually very slightly worse than the 2080, so shows the individual power of the GPU actually in performance here, so not affected by the CPU at all or outside factors. Really pulling ahead here with almost triple the score on test 1 and test 2 in these results. So all in all, the RTX 2080, especially when games are maxed out, can deliver the punch to a lot of these games, especially if you have a higher refresh rate monitor and want to be competitive, especially in multiplayer games, whilst having some of the better graphics. Something interesting is looking at the pricing of graphics cards at the moment. So the MSI 980 Afterburner on Amazon new is £505. However, I think this is just because this is a very old model and it's just one of those cards that's just got a random price on it, whereas a better model, the same with the MSI, with a bit more overclock and fans, was £401, which is a bit more realistic. Whereas the MSI RX 2080 Duke is £737 on Amazon UK. Now you might be watching this thinking whether or not it's worth an upgrade to one of these new gen cards, and obviously showing off this MSI RX 2080. The results speak for themselves, but it's always up to you. Where are you willing to sacrifice some graphical performance, lowering some settings, just a tweak to keep yourself going, or do you think it's time to make that upgrade? Anyway, that's the battle over. I do think the 2080's won by a far margin here. Papa 980 must be rather sad now that his grandchild has taken him over, but that's kind of the way of the world. He's just a simple grandpa. Anyway, thank you all very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, hit that like button, subscribe for more of my content, and I'll see you all next time. Joshino.